Planning a fishing trip shouldn't feel like a full-time job. With fishingbooker.com, you can find and book the perfect fishing trip within minutes. Fishingbooker.com connects you with trusted fishing captains around the world. Booking is fast, easy, and secure, with access to verified customer reviews, loyalty rewards, and around-the-clock customer support. Everything you need to book with confidence is in one place. So head to fishingbooker.com and start planning your next fishing adventure today.
You can preserve food without electricity. You don't need a compressor, a chest freezer, or even a cold climate. For most of human history, if you wanted to keep meat from spoiling, you used salt. Today, we're talking about curing and salting, how it works, where it came from, and what it actually does to wild meat and fish. This isn't about fancy charcuterie boards or hobby projects. It's about one of the oldest preservation tools we have. To understand curing, we need to think less about flavor and more about control.
Join Justin Townsend and the Harvesting Nature crew as they explore the world of cooking wild fish and game while sharing recipes, tips, tricks, and lessons learned from their pursuit of wild food. We sure hope you ate before the show, 'cause you're gonna leave hungry. This is the Wild Fish and Game Podcast.
Welcome back to the Wild Fishing Game Podcast. I'm your host, Justin Townsend, and I'm joined by Adam Berkelmans.
Hello, everybody.
This is the Wild Pantry, our monthly series on preserving wild food. Last episode, we talked about freezing, how it works, what it does for food, and how to do it better. Today, we're stepping way back. Before mechanical refrigeration, before household freezers, preserving meat and fish usually meant one thing: salt. We're going to break down where curing and salting come from, what salting is actually doing on a physical level, how curing differs from simple salting, and how to apply it safely at home with wild game and fish. This isn't about guesswork. Like freezing, curing rewards precision and punishes shortcuts. Adam, let's start with where it all began.
Yeah, let's get into it. So salt preservation predates refrigeration by thousands of years, obviously. And in many places, it actually even predates recorded history. So it's been used for a long, long time to help keep food fresh. Any culture that harvested more meat or fish than it could be eaten immediately had to solve the same problem all across the world. How do you slow spoilage without cold? In hot climates, salting was often the only reliable option. Fish were split, packed in salt, dried in the sun. The meat was rubbed heavily and hung to dehydrate. In colder regions, salting was frequently combined with air drying or smoking to extend shelf life even further, two topics we'll be exploring further in this podcast series. Going all the way back to ancient Egypt, they salted their fish and meat along the Nile, while the Chinese have records describing salt preservation methods going back thousands of years. Roman trade routes moved salted pork and fish across long distances, and Northern European communities relied on salted cod and herring to feed inland populations for the winter that didn't have access to fresh fish on the coast. What's important to understand is that salting wasn't about luxury or flavor development necessarily. It was more about keeping food stable. It allowed food to survive transport, trade, seasonal gaps in availability. It also allowed hunters and fishermen to harvest in abundance without losing everything to spoiling. Unlike freezing, which became reliable and widespread only in the pretty much last century, salting shaped food systems for millennia, for most of human existence. It influenced migration patterns, trade routes, military supply chains, and even settlement. But historically, people weren't just guessing about how much salt was needed. Salt was very expensive and meat was very valuable, and that meant failure had big consequences. We've all heard the thing now of Roman soldiers getting paid in salt, and that's where the word salary comes from. I think it's everyone's favorite little factoid. But they were paid in salt because it was very expensive and very valuable. Curing developed kind of as a method that depended on observation, repetition, and eventually measurement. It wasn't just kind of willy-nilly. In hunting cultures specifically, salting was often a practical response to success. So a single large animal, moose, elk, caribou, produces far more meat than one household can eat fresh. And if you can picture like the places like Head Smash and Buffalo Jump, which is my favorite named place in the world, I think, where they would push bison off of cliffs, Think of how much meat that would result in for a community that wouldn't have been able to be eaten fresh. So they would have had to salt and dry all of this very quickly in order to stop spoilage. Strips are cut thin, salted heavily, sometimes dried or smoked, and would be stored for later use. Fish runs created a similar urgency. When salmon and cod were running strong, you can kind of picture those, like all the salmon running up the river. It's like a big glut of food all at once. Preservation wasn't really an option. It was the only way to prevent waste. Salting turned a short window of abundance into months of usable food, which really allowed humans to spread and culturally evolve. To understand why it works and where it can go wrong, we need to look at what salt is actually doing inside the meat and kind of the science. So, Justin, what's happening when we salt something?
Well, first on, I want to talk a little bit about, have you ever read the book Salt by Mark Kurlansky?
Yeah, one of my favorites, and I just interviewed Mark for our other podcast series about the use of salt in Newfoundland. So stay tuned for the Wild American Foodscapes Newfoundland episode, and there's a phone conversation I had with Mark on that.
That's really awesome. Excited to hear that interview. But on a note about the book itself, for those who haven't read it, so it's a book exploring kind of the impact of salt on human civilization, its role as a currency and a driver of trade, wars, and empires, and its importance in food, religion, and even broader culture. So excited to hear that interview on those sound bites of the Wild American Foodscapes. So that should be super exciting. But no, I haven't read the book either. I always wanted to pick it up and read it. So I think maybe now's a better time than ever, right?
I highly recommend all his books. He kind of takes a subject like salt or cod or different things like that. And I think he said he's working on one about lobster right now. Ooh. And just looks at like kind of humanity through the lens of that. So how it affected, shipping and settlement and all these different crazy things. Highly recommend his books. It's Mark Kurlansky.
That's really cool. Well, let's talk a little bit about the science. So put on your Bill Nye the Science Guy lab coat for a minute. And at its core, salting works by just controlling water. And just controlling water is very much an understatement. But here's why. Microorganisms need water to grow. Bacteria, molds, and yeast all depend on available moisture inside food. And when we add salt, we change how the water behaves. Salt draws moisture out of the cells through osmosis. Water moves from an area of lower salt concentration to that of a higher salt concentration. As moisture leaves the meat, the microbial environment becomes less stable. This is where the concept of water activity comes in. Water activity is the amount of unbound water available for microbial growth. When salt binds water or pulls it out of the tissue, water activity drops and microbial growth slows dramatically. There are two primary ways that we apply salt. The first is drying salt, known as dry brining. Salt is applied directly to the surface of the meat or fish, and it begins drawing moisture outward immediately. Over time, salt also moves inward, seasoning and stabilizing the interior. The second is brining, or wet salting. Salt is dissolved in water, and the meat is submerged. In this case, the salt moves into the meat while some of the moisture moves out. The concentration of the brine and how long a piece of protein is left in the brine determines how aggressively that exchange happens. A light and short brine makes for a more tender and juicier piece of meat, while a heavy and long brine makes for a salty piece of meat that will last a long time. It's important to separate salting from curing because people often use those terms interchangeably. Salting alone reduces water activity and slows spoilage. Curing traditionally refers to salting plus the addition of nitrates or nitrites. Those compounds serve a specific purpose. They inhibit the growth of botulism. There's a bacterial name, but I'm not going to try to pronounce it because I don't speak Latin.
Clostridium botulinum or something
like that?
Yes,
Clostridium botulinum. I still have my Bill Nye the Science Guy jacket on, so I'll
you might be asking for it back after that.
Yeah, probably. Another thing that the nitrates and nitrites do is they also stabilize the color and contribute to the flavor people associate with cured meats like ham or bacon. Not every salted product requires nitrites, but certain preparations, especially low oxygen, long-term cures, depend on safety. Salt's powerful, but is in the sterilizer. It changes the environment, it reduces risk, but it does not eliminate it. Adam, let's talk about where people get into trouble with this.
Yes, because when you're working with that at home, there's some questions that need answering. We know that curing and saltive are effective, but they're not actually really forgiving. Unlike freezing, which mostly pauses microbial activity, which we talked about in our last episode, curing actively changes the environment inside the meat. So instead of kind of putting it on hold, it's changing everything inside. That means small errors can have larger consequences later down the line. The biggest mistake people make is guessing. So salt percentages matter, the thickness of what you're curing or salting matters, temperature matters, time matters. If you're dry curing, the salt needs to be measured by weight, not by feel. And a digital scale is not optional for long cures and is a cheap piece of equipment that I think all hunters should have in their kitchens. Especially if you're salting and curing, it is non-optional. Temperature control is just as important. Most home curing should still happen under refrigeration unless you're working in a carefully controlled environment. Curing at room temperature can be very risky, especially with North America's variable weather conditions. So a lot of these old salting and curing recipes and methods that we encounter online came from places like France or Germany or Italy, which have more stable humidities and temperatures. They were being done in, basements of 800-year-old houses and caves and different stuff. So when we're working in North America, we can't take that same wisdom and apply it directly here. There are certain places that are beneficial for these types of things, but often not. So you got to understand that you can't just necessarily cure a sausage in your basement. There's a lot of things that go into that. It's also important to understand what salt does not do. Salt does not kill parasites reliably. Salt does not make poorly handled meat safe. And salt does not replace proper field care. Very important to note. If an animal is gut shot or mishandled, dragged through the dirt, salting and curing won't fix that. If the meat sat out for too long on a warm counter, salt's not going to reset it again. When nitrates are used properly, they significantly reduce the risk of botulism in certain preparations, especially those stored in low oxygen environments. But they also require accurate measurement and correct usage. Too much curing salt can actually be quite toxic. You can't just take a pinch and hope for the best. It all has to be done with measurements. Curing does not eliminate the need to cook species that carry parasitic risks, such as bear or wild pigs. Those still require proper internal cooking temperatures. So just because you cured, say, wild pig bacon or something like that, that doesn't mean that the risk is totally gone of trichinosis. You still have to cook it after salting. But the general takeaway is pretty simple. Curing is controlled dehydration, not sterilization. So keep that in mind. Precision reduces risk, but guesswork and cut corners increases it. So if all that safety depends on precision, let's talk about how to apply this realistically at home. Justin?
Most people listening to this aren't building curing chambers in their basement, although you should be. But let's focus on what's realistic and useful for wild game at home. First off, dry brining. This is probably the most accessible starting point. We've already touched on it a little bit, but in its simplest form, as I mentioned, it's controlled salting. Weigh the meat, use 1 to 2% salt by weight, apply evenly on all sides, rest uncovered in the refrigerator for 12 to 48 hours. Dry brining will improve the seasoning and help the meat retain moisture during cooking. It's not long-term preservation, but it's controlled salting, and it builds good habits on the more advanced. So think about some cuts it would work with. So venison roast, elk steaks, wild turkey breast, large waterfowl. It's precise, low risk, easy to execute. Another things like gravlax is probably a very common one that you'll see. I know some of the smoked salmon will be made that way. Lots of different applications for it, so use it. Next one I recommend is your basic wet brining. This is probably the most highly used around Thanksgiving time. If you're going to brine turkey, it's probably one of the best methods to keep it from getting bone dry. But it uses basically a saltwater solution, as it implies, wet brining. But it's a secondary step up. So you're going to do 5 to 8% salt by weight of water. Fully submerge the meat. Keep it refrigerated at all times. And brining is useful for lean proteins, as I mentioned, and those that benefit from moisture retention before smoking or roasting. Think about whole upland birds, waterfowl, tougher cuts. You can use those. Again, measure, don't guess. And number 3. This is your short-term salt cures. This is where we start to dive a little deeper. This will extend the whole application beyond just flavor and tenderness. Examples include lightly cured duck breast, salt and air-dried strips for jerky preparations. These methods use higher salt percentages, remove more of the moisture, they extend the shelf life slightly, but they still require refrigeration. This is controlled dehydration, not shelf-stable preservation. We're getting there, don't worry. Next up, we've got long-term dry curing. This is where we start to get a little more advanced. So this includes whole muscle cures like braciole, air-dried duck prosciutto, cured and smoked sausages, and these require precise salt calculations, often curing salts with nitrate. Also, you want to pay attention to your temperature and humidity. And, most importantly of all, you've got to have patience. This is not the place to be impulsive or improvise. It can absolutely be done at home, as it has been for many hundreds of years, but it demands research, accurate scales, and environmental control. For most hunters and anglers, the first 2 methods are more than enough to add value and control without adding risk. Salt's scalable, so you don't have to jump straight to the hanging meat in the basement. Start at the beginning and buy yourself some books and thoroughly research the subject before moving into the intermediate stuff. What methods do you tend to use at home, Adam?
Well, I tend to do a lot of dry brining. That's kind of my go-to for like steaks or kind of thinner things like say a duck breast or turkey breast or a steak. I will salt it generously if I have the forethought and keep it in the fridge overnight and let it kind of do its thing, and then I'll cook the next day. If I forgot to do that, I'll even try to do that 2 hours beforehand or something, because it does make a little bit of a difference. And then I've also done some of the projects like the cured and salted duck breast and gravlax and stuff like that, where it's like more like a week-long project. You're getting something that's in the end sliced thinly. It's pretty salty, but it goes good on like a charcuterie board, something like that. So it's like a nice little project that pretty much anyone can do. Especially with duck breast. I highly recommend it. Everyone try that as their first kind of project after dry and wet brining. But I haven't gotten into the like super stuff where like things are hanging for months. That's somewhere that's kind of next on the docket for what I want to attempt with the food in my life. How about yourself? Do you use any of these things?
I tend to lean towards the wet brine quite a bit, and that's usually because I like to smoke some of the larger muscle cuts, and so when you're thinking like pastrami or corned anything, that's a good thing. Also too, I mentioned like turkeys and things like that. I think those brines help that moisture content exponentially. Another good one, I've done the salted dry brines on like fish and stuff. That's always fun to do, and then kind of eat it, on crackers with like really great sausage and things like that. But also, like, I like to use salt on vegetables. We didn't really touch on that, and I don't think we're going to dive into it, but you get things like... I
think I got a little bit on it, but yeah.
You get like kimchi's and things like that. One of my favorite methods, I forget which one of the famed chef, maybe it's Thomas Keller, uses one on zucchinis where they like slice the zucchini long ways and you put the salt on the top and it pulls all the moisture out, and then you like crisscross it and then you sear it on the pan. That's like hands down probably one of my favorite ways to cook like zucchini and squash, and I really, really love zucchini and squash. So it's like I've
been doing that a lot lately to that same method from Thomas Keller. I love it.
I like the contrast between the crunchy you get, but that salt really pulls out the moisture, and it's surprising how much moisture is actually in the zucchini or the squash, and then you get that nice crunch and then that like soft after taste, which I really enjoy. Yeah. So,
for anyone ever wondering how much water is actually in vegetables, one thing you can do is take a potato and just run it through the cheese grater, then take it in your hands and squeeze it over to the sink, and it's insane how much water pours out of that potato. And salting will draw that water out, meaning that it doesn't end up in the pan. So, like you said, cooking zucchini, when you cook it, it's going to want to release water, but if you use the salt beforehand to pull that water out, it's going to sear much nicer and have a much nicer brown kind of seared edge and everything. So yeah, it's crazy how much water is actually in all these things that we're cooking. So it's Everyone try that out. Just grate a potato and squeeze it over the sink. You'll be shocked.
And then make hash browns.
Yeah,
because they're phenomenal. And if you really want to get advanced, you do that. Then you soak your potatoes in water to draw out some of the starch, and then you wring it out again, and then you cook hash browns in loads of butter. Yeah. And that's like the best hash browns ever. All right, what about fish specifically? Where has salting added some unique considerations in the world of fish?
Well, fish is interesting because it responds to salt faster than red meat. I think the texture is more of an open grain, and it's a softer flesh, and salt will affect it much faster.
It lives in salt water, so that must affect it, right?
Yeah, they come in pre-brined.
Pre-brined.
Yeah. Never actually thought about that before. I wonder what the salt content in ocean fish in the flesh is compared to freshwater fish.
Probably write a book about it.
Yeah. But the fish's muscle structure is much more delicate. The moisture content is also much higher than red meat. The fibers are shorter. All this means that salt penetrates quickly, and oversalting can happen very quickly as well. So light salting is often used to firm the flesh before cooking or smoking. Even a short dry brine, like 1 to 2% salt by weight for a few hours, will noticeably tighten the texture and improve moisture retention. So that's good to know if you're smoking fish. But even if you're just going to fry a piece of fish up on your cast iron or something, salting it for an hour or two beforehand will improve it. When we use heavier salting, it's drawing out significant moisture. So historically, fish were split, packed in salt, and sometimes layered in barrels. That level of salting required soaking before cooking to remove excess salt. So if you've ever had saltfish, like Jamaican saltfish, bacalhau, it's like the Portuguese or Italian style saltfish. If you just put that right into a dish, it's going to be so salty you can't eat the dish. So that salt has been used to make it shelf stable, so it can stay shelf stable for months like that. But you have to soak the salt back out of the fish to use it, which creates kind of like a different textured fish, which is why it's so looked after.
But it's crazy cool because people in those cultures that eat that type of fish, like the bacalhau or the aki or any of that, that's a staple in their culture, which is crazy because we talked a lot about that kind of in the Hawaii episode we did on the Wild American Foodscapes, and it's interesting to see how those preservation methods that maybe weren't always present or were present but used with different things now. You think about in Brazil, the bacalhau being very present, or even in Jamaica, and that really being a result of people traveling to the place from somewhere else and then creating sort of what was established as a major dependable food source for the local population. So salted cod is to Brazil what Spam is to Hawaii, which is wild.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's really interesting too, just as a little aside, but the trade routes, the cod was mostly being caught off the banks of Newfoundland, and they were shipped down by British, Basque, and Portuguese traders, and they would be shipped down to the Caribbean, where it would often be traded for rum, because in the Caribbean they had all the sugar plantations, and then that rum would make its way back. So if you look at the alcohol usage in Canada, let's say, rum is very low on the list because it tends to be more of a tropical drink. But in Newfoundland, it's all the rage. That's where they have Newfie Screech, just all these different things. It's a very popular thing, and that's directly from the saltfish trade with Jamaica. So you can see all these kind of cool historical lines, and that's what really gets me going. I'm a big nerd for stuff like that. Let's get back to using it at home instead of talking history here. For home use with wild fish, most people are working in short-term to medium-term kind of territory. So we're talking about gravlax, like we mentioned, which is just like a trout or salmon done in a Scandinavian-style cure. Usually uses salt and sugar. You can actually incorporate some really cool flavors like spruce tips or some other wild things into that, which is cool, or wild spices, juniper berries, stuff like that. For wild fish, we're also using light dry cures before smoking, or brining fillets prior to hot smoking. So you can use it for cold or hot smoking, or like I said, just if you're going to be roasting a fish or cooking it, grilling it, it's nice to salt. Another important distinction though, just like with our bears and wild pigs, salt does not reliably kill marine parasites either. So if you're preparing fish or raw or lightly cured applications, those freezing protocols still matter. In many cases, freezing to the appropriate temperature for saturation is necessary before curing to avoid marine parasites. And that's with your fresh fish too. So you're dealing with something like pike or something like that. You want to make sure it's hard frozen first before trying these curing methods out. Also, as with all preservation, quality begins at harvest. So fish that are bled quickly, cooled immediately, kept clean, respond far better curing than fish that sat warm in a live well or on a stringer for, half a day. So go back to our fish episodes, go back to our ikojime episodes and teach us how to properly take care of your fish. You'll end up with a better product, even if you're salting it. Salt can improve texture and extend usability, but it can't really correct poor handling. So always remember that. Salt also isn't just for meat and fish. It plays a role with wild plants too, especially mushrooms and leafy greens, like we mentioned before. With mushrooms, salt is often used as a moisture replacement tool. So while mushrooms carry a lot of water, and salting them lightly before cooking helps draw out that excess moisture and concentrate the flavor. So if you ever notice dumping a bunch of mushrooms in a frying pan, they just kind of like leak out all their water. Using salt at the right time can, avoid that or use that. In some traditions, mushrooms are actually layered with salt and allowed to release the liquid before being stored without refrigeration for short periods of time. So you see that a lot in Eastern Europe. I recommend everyone be careful with a lot of these kind of folk recipes because botulism and different things can occur. You want to take it seriously. Heavier salting, especially when paired with fermentation, which we'll cover in another one of these episodes, can preserve mushrooms much longer, but that moves into a different process with its own controls, and we're not really going to get into that. It also, I don't think I have to say it, but salting does not take out any of the toxins in mushrooms, so don't think you can salt like a death cap and make it edible, so don't be going and doing anything stupid like that. Leafy greens also respond quickly to salt, so light salting softens those cell walls and pulls out the moisture, which is why salted greens collapse so dramatically. So if you just put some salt on, say, spinach or something, it will just completely collapse within minutes. This can be useful for short-term preservation, especially when followed by fermentation or refrigeration. A good regional example of this is Quebec's herbes salées, which means salted herbs. They're basically chopped garden herbs layered with salt and packed tightly into jars. So they kind of just layer it with coarse salt. The salt draws out the moisture, creates concentrated seasoning that can last for months in the refrigerator. So it's not quite shelf stable, but it's an effective way to extend the usefulness of fresh herbs through the winter after you harvest them in prime time this summer. A little spoonful of this really salty herbaceous kind of mix is like amazing in soup, amazing gravies. You can kind of like use it sparingly. That same principle applies to wild greens, tender shoots, all sorts of different wild edibles. Salt can help preserve flavor and texture in the short term, but without drying or fermentation or pickling, these things still remain perishable. So it's kind of a short-term solution. You can push things for a few weeks, but maybe not for months. For most wild foragers, salting mushrooms and greens is about texture control, flavor concentration, and short-term storage rather than longer forms of preservations. So whether we're working with meat or fish or plants, salt is always changing the internal structure of them. Could you talk a little bit about what happens to the texture and flavor when we're salting, Justin?
Absolutely, Adam. I would be more than happy to.
Let's hear it.
When you salt something, you're not just preserving it, you're altering its structure. Salt affects proteins directly. So as it penetrates the meat or fish, it begins to dissolve certain muscle proteins and change how they bind to water. That's why properly salted meat often retains moisture better during cooking, even though salt initially draws moisture out. So with the longer cures, the change becomes more pronounced. As water leaves the tissue, the muscle fibers tighten and concentrate. The flavor intensifies because there's less water diluting it. Texture becomes firmer, sometimes denser, sometimes sliceables in ways fresh meat isn't. The goal with many cured products is controlled dehydration and structural change, but it's easy to overshoot. Too much salt or too much time can produce a texture that's overly firm or dry. Too little salt can leave the interior inconsistent, and thickness plays a role here as well. Thicker cuts take longer for salt to distribute evenly. Salt also impacts flavor perception beyond simple saltiness. It enhances savory compounds, suppresses bitterness, and changes how we perceive fat. That's part of why even a short dry brine can make wild meat taste more rounded and balanced. The key thing to remember is curing, it's not neutral. Freezing tries to preserve the original state of food. Salting accepts that change is happening and directs it. So, when do you reach for salt instead of the freezer, Adam?
Well, it kind of depends. Freezing and salting solve like different problems. If your goal is to keep meat as close to its original state as possible, freezing is usually the better option because it preserves structure reasonably well. It's predictable. It allows you to cook the product later without much transformation. Salting, on the other hand, makes more sense when you want change. If you're looking to firm up texture before smoking, if you're looking to concentrate flavor and umami, extend usability without relying on your freezer space, that's when salt really becomes useful. Freezing is passive. Like once you wrap and store it, you just mostly leave it alone. It's just there, ready for you. While salting is active. So you measure, you monitor, you adjust, you plan ahead, you check in on it, you sing to it. It's an active process. Freezing works great, for bulk harvest when you have the space and power to do so. But salting works better when you're dealing with, trim or smaller cuts. You want shelf life that's measured in weeks instead of days or months or years. You're preparing for smoking or air drying. You want a different texture and flavor outcome, or you're working with something like making that duck breast prosciutto, where you're looking to completely create a new product with an old one. So freezing and salting aren't necessarily competitors. They're just tools in the toolkit. Most wild kitchens, you're going to use both. Sometimes on the same animal, sometimes on the same piece of meat. Or fish, like we said, sometimes fish needs to be frozen first to kill bacteria and parasites and then cured. So you're using the same or two methods on the same piece of protein. One thing you might be asking now is which salts should we be using for curing? Because there's lots of different salts out there. Salts having a moment. There's Himalayan pink salts and black salts and red salts and brown salts and all sorts of stuff. So what do you think we should be using for curing?
Well, I'll tell you that not all salts are created equal. So using the wrong salt can certainly cause problems way beyond just curing. Table salts often contain iodine and anti-caking agents, which can introduce off flavors or slight cloudiness in brines. There's also a lot of weird things that happen with iodized salt that you probably kind of just want to steer away from. I'm not sure the history of why it was added in. There's definitely a reason. I think it's nutritionally bound.
So iodine was added to salt because a lack of iodine in your diet can cause goiters. So places that are far from the ocean, including like Switzerland and places in the Midwest in the States, it was known that their populace would have these huge goiters on their necks because they weren't getting enough iodine. So anyone living near the coast got iodine through eating seafood, so they were fine. So it was all these like kind of interior people who were suffering. So the government started adding iodine to salt because it was used by everyone on every table, and it actually made this whole goiter situation go away almost 100%. So iodine is super important. You should continue eating table salt in certain situations. They said that goiters are back on the rise because everyone's using these fancy sea salts now, and if they're not eating enough... or not sea salts, these fancy other salts like Himalayan pink salt, if they're not eating enough seafood, then they can actually get these iodine deficiencies again. I think anyone with a varied diet, like us, we don't have to worry about that at all. But if you hate seafood and you never get any in your diet at all, then iodized table salt might be something you want to use, just not for any of these projects. That's my little spiel on goiters and salts.
Nice. Yeah, no, I see it now. I'm looking. So goiter is an abnormal enlargement of butterfly-shaped thyroid gland in the neck. It's often causing visible swelling at the base of the throat. Common causes include iodine deficiency, Hashimoto's disease, and Graves' disease. Which is crazy. That is frightening. Yeah, now I know. Now you all know. You're welcome. Well, now that we know why it's added in, let's talk about it from a curing salting perspective, which you're going to want to use those non-iodized salts for that. Good options include kosher salt, pickling or canning salt, and plain sea salt without additives. My probably go-to is the kosher salt. I generally use it for a lot of things. I like the way that it holds flavor. If you want to dive down like a cool geeky rabbit hole, go look at the sizes and variation of the different types of salt and their formations. What's really cool is kosher salt tends to have like this crystallized formation with kind of like an empty center in between, which helps hold like liquids and things like that it bonds with, which is, I don't know, really cool science.
Yeah, I use mostly kosher salt.
Yeah,
kosher salt in the kitchen. Yeah.
But what matters most is that the salt's pure sodium chloride with no anti-caking agents. You don't want that extra stuff in there. And that you measure by weight, think metric, not volume, since the crystal size, as I mentioned, varies differently between the brands. How does this all fit into our broader Wild Pantry approach?
Well, I'd say if there's one takeaway from all this, it's that curing and salting aren't necessarily complicated, but they do require attention and intention. You don't necessarily need a curing chamber, although they're very cool and necessary if you want to get into some of this advanced stuff we've been mentioning. But you don't need special equipment beyond a good scale and a refrigerator. So it's very easy. You can, keep it in your toolkit. What you do need when it comes to salting is consistency. So like we said, measure by weight. So we're working in grams, not teaspoons. Control your temperature, control your humidity, and start always with high quality medium fish. And the same goes for mushrooms and greens and everything too. For most wild harvesters, dry brining and short cures will add more value to your cooking than attempting long-term dry curing products right away. So like, if you've never done any of this stuff, go the baby step method. Don't jump into like hanging an 8-month sausage project in your basement. It's probably not going to work, and it's going to end in tears or botulism. So, start small, work your way up. Those projects will be there waiting for you once you take the first few steps. Remember that freezing gives you time, but salting asks you to pay attention. Both belong in the wild kitchen, as will all the other techniques we're going to talk about in this series, which I'm pretty excited about to get into all of them. So what do you think, Justin? Would you buy or build a curing chamber for yourself in your house?
I feel like yes. I think here it's interesting enough in Hawaii, the bacteria and just the general fungus in the air is exponentially high just to being in a tropical climate. Like, things go bad quicker here, so we rely a lot more on refrigeration in order to keep things that you wouldn't normally have to worry about in other places. Just like things go bad quickly, like even just as simple as bread. So I think in order to do any sort of like long-term curing or stuff like that, I really would want to focus on the control of an environment, because both that humidity varies so much, and we have an open house here, so we're constantly at the will of the environment to drive humidity. So having a control aspect is going to be much more important. I think too, if you think about other places kind of around the U.S., if you're really, or North America, sorry, go USA hockey, I guess. I didn't watch the game, so no worries. Sorry, people. It's a big time difference.
Yeah.
If you're talking about like the variability in temperature control, it's like becomes really challenging as you look across North America and just the different climates and humidity levels that we have, and also to like seasonality. You're largely more humid times, or you're not as able to do things and control humidity as well as more drier times, I guess, and vice versa, right? So depending on where you're at, like, it's very interesting because historically the places you live at now probably have a traditional curing method that someone has used over and over and over without a curing chamber or without refrigeration, that they were able to do things pretty regularly. So I don't know, Adam, what are your thoughts? Curing chamber, yes or no?
I think so. I think where I'm at in all of this, a curing chamber is my next step. And we've been talking about this, but for people who don't know, a curing chamber, you can either buy one for probably thousands of dollars, or you can use an old fridge, a bar fridge, and there's these tools you can buy that kind of like hijack the humidity and temperature controls. You can kind of retrofit it into like a curing chamber. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. I recommend you Google and check it out because there's lots of cool options for that. Part of what's been holding me back a little bit is we're always in two different places, but that's going to change soon. I think we're going to be living in one place for the foreseeable future coming up relatively soon. And I think in that situation, I'm going to make myself a curing chamber and start experimenting. But as it is now, I'm often gone for weeks at a time, and it's just I can't pay attention to the projects like I need to. But I'm very excited about it. I want to get into some of these like more advanced curing methods, and I'm excited to see where I can take wild game and fish and edibles into that kind of world. So pretty cool.
Our friends over at Elevated Wild have a great article that says how to build a curing chamber.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, they're pretty cool. So yeah, it's pretty detailed if you wanted to get into it. It seems like a really good article. We'll throw that in the show notes there. And yeah, that'll be a fun project if you're looking for something between now and hunting season to get prepped if you want to dive into that world. But next month on Wild Pantry, we're going to keep building this series and move into another preservation method, hot and cold smoking. And we're going to talk about how it fits into the modern wild kitchen, which for many of you know, it fits very, very well. For those that may not know, get ready, because we're going to talk about it ad nauseum. No, it'll be fun. But thanks everybody out there for listening. Appreciate the dedication, the time. As always, the show notes will be online. Make sure you head over to social media. Give us a follow. Harvest Nature, Trepid Eater, Ventures for Food. We're all here at your beck and call should you have questions about curing, salting, all that stuff we talked about today, and just generally just want to say hi. But everybody else, please punch that 5-star button, leave us a review, tell us what you like, or tell us the things we're doing wrong, and we'll comment back. So thanks everybody. Have a good day.